Hi, ladies and gents. Today, our group will be talking about a Mexican-born electronic artist, Rafael Lozano-Hemmer. What is so special and different and innovative about him, you may ask? Well, it's the fact that he integrates new media and innovative new technologies into his artwork. He creates art in the form of robotic, projections, cell phones, sensors, cameras, the internet, GPS programs, uses electricity, light, and more to create art pieces that defines him as somewhat different from other artists that don't usually use technology in their work. With this, he creates architectural and performance art, which he displays in galleries, public areas, and cities. Some of his work also requires his fans or the public to interact with the art and immerse themselves in it, such as his piece Articulated Intersect. I'll be discussing the societal cultural context from his artworks and focusing on architectural intersects, which resided in Montreal, Quebec in a public area called Place des Festivals, adjacent to the Museum of Contemporary Art of Montreal, and I'll explain his culture and the meaning of his artworks through his cultural views. Now, Rafael Lozano stated, even if you are not using a computer, you are affected by this environment. Working with technology is inevitable. Our politics, our culture, our economy, everything is running through globalized networks of communication. He understands that today's culture is greatly affected by technological advances, robotics, and modern inventions that are seen everywhere. That's why he creates art that resembles technology. Rafael was born in Mexico in 1967 and lived there until the age of 18. After, he moved to Canada to study science in the University of British Columbia. In Mexico, he was the son to nightclub owners. Thus, throughout his childhood, he was always interacting with light and technology in his culture, which led him to be interested in the fields of experiential science. This, in a way, influenced him to start mixing his artwork, his science, and his passion for creating new and innovative artworks with his culture. His art piece Articulated intersects with other similar art pieces of his. He has created 7 different artworks that involve beams of light shooting up in the air. Here is a clip of Articulated Intersect, situated in Montreal. His one piece that speaks out about his culture that is also very similar to Articulated Intersects is Voz Alta, translating to loud voice. The artwork consists of a megaphone placed on top of a building which shines a bright beaming light across Mexico City, where he was born, when someone speaks into the microphone. Now, why is this relevant, you may ask? It's because of the meaning behind the piece. A historical Mexican cultural massacre that happened in October 2nd, 1968, which led to the influence of his creation by Rafael. He wanted his people to feel powerful when they spoke, and feel a sense of justice and pride in seeing how far the Mexican government has come since the massacre by the Mexican military on a peaceful protest which left hundreds and hundreds dead. This is what fuels his art, his passion for technology, his culture, and the people that follow him and come in contact with his art. This art piece was made 3 years ago, before Articulated Intersect. Here is a clip of it.
Empieza a surgir el movimiento y el preámbulo claro es la decisión de resistencia.
El periódico mural de ciencias políticas y era muy creativo. Lo hacían entre Godet, Eligio Calderón y Paco Ignacio Taibo. Ellos eran la brigada Marilyn Monroe y cuando salían perdían los volantes, no sabían a qué dirección tenían que ir. Lo mejor era que se quedara la Marilyn Monroe, se quedara en ciencias políticas inventando cosas.
The light beam he uses in Articulated Intersects is the same type of light that the US government uses in patrolling the US and Mexican border. When making articulated intersects, the city of Montreal selected an area known as the Place des Festivals for his project to be displayed. This public area had been formerly known as the red light district that the city of Montreal was trying so hard to erase from their history. Raphael agreed to display his work, and by doing so, he aided in bringing something new and innovative to an area that had a bad reputation and gave Montreal City a bad name. His project gave the people of Montreal something positive to be remembered culturally in that area, and not by the shady red district area that was in the past, and that the people had tried so hard to leave in the past. He quotes, "What I sought out to do for the first time was to materialize this fleeting matter that is light into something sculptural, to play, so that people who are in public spaces stop, forget their everyday activities, and speak to one another." His passion for this project came from his own culture, aiding the city of Montreal to remake the area in which the project had been placed, and the relationship he has to the public, in the way that he wants to intercommunicate his art with people living their everyday lives and coming across his art on their nightly routines. That is how he combines his culture with his art and his art with his people.
Conceptual influences.
I'm Anna Colassa, and I'll be talking about the conceptual influences relating to Rafael Lozano-Hemmer's articulated intersect. Participation is an integral element of articulated intersect, and without its participants, the installation does not function. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer creates platforms for members of the public to explore and interact with. This engagement serves for more than the purpose of display. It is the opportunity for members of the public to give new meaning to public space by changing the way they perceive and interact with it. The focus is primarily on interaction the user has with the space, as opposed to the formal considerations of art. He aims to demonumentalize the pre-existing ideas attached to urban settings through his installations, and focus on the personal experience or narrative created using the body, architecture, and space. Relational architecture is a term he uses that refers to the idea that the body and architecture are interconnected, as he quotes, "the technological actualization of buildings with alien memory." Architecture is both built by and experienced by the body, so Hemmer uses his installations to invite the participant to physically interact with the space, and in this way they become emotionally involved as a contributor in the space rather than just an inhabitant of it. In this way, it's like the reclaiming of undefined space back to the public. A conceptual influence in his work is the stridentist movement, or estridentismo, which occurred in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution in 1921. This avant-garde movement, which was influenced by some of the characteristics of Cubism, Dadaism, Futurism, and Ultraism, was conceived when the poet Manuel Maples Arce produced his first manifesto. The movement was multidisciplinary and included poets, writers, visual artists, musicians, and photographers. They rejected academic conservatism and celebrated modernity and technological novelty. Not only did they seek to transform the written and visual language, but they also sought to change the perception of the urban environment, and they did so in a way that utilized public involvement to carry forth ideas. These key principles in the stridentist movement can be seen to resonate in the core concepts that reside within Hemmer's work. Another influence that Hemmer personally speaks about having impact on his work is the Monument Against Fascism by Johann Gers and Esther Gers. They created a 12-meter-high lead column, which was presented in 1986 in Hamburg, Germany. Next to the monument, they provided a metal pencil and a panel that read the following: "We invite the citizens of Hamburg and visitors to the town to add their names here to ours. In doing so, we will commit ourselves to remain vigilant. As more and more names cover this 12-meter-high lead column, it will gradually be lowered into the ground. One day, it will have disappeared completely, and the site of Hamburg Monument Against Fascism will be empty. In the long run, it is only we ourselves who can stand up against injustice." The monument was lowered 8 times between October 10th, 1986 and November 10th, 1993. This monument uses the public space and the interaction with the public to send forth a message against fascism. By the time The monument was fully lowered into the ground. It had 70,000 signatures on it. This monument used the participation of the members of the public and public space as a way to actively engage with the message the monument was trying to send. In this way, members of the public are part of the monument, not just observers of it. This relates back to Hemmer's use of public participation as an integral part of his work.
Artistic practices.
Rafael Lozano-Hemmer's practice tends to revolve around audience participation. His use of public space helps reinforce and recontextualize civic engagement and the way that people interact with the city. In 1994, Lozano-Hemmer coined the term relational architecture as the technological actualization of buildings and the urban environment. He aimed to transform the dominant narratives of a specific building or urban setting by superimposing audiovisual elements to affect it and recontextualize it. Curator Timothy Druckery described his practice accordingly as a somewhat defiant act that transposes interior and exterior space, something that helps reclaim the public square as a site of public discourse and engagement. It's a reimagining of public will. The infrastructure of a city comes with its own baggage. It has its own history. It has its own meaning. And allowing citizens to interact with it through Lozano-Hemmer's work recontextualizes their role within that city framework and amongst those historical buildings and urban centers. Articulated Intersect represents one of his most impactful works along these lines in terms of recontextualizing public space and the users who operate within it. There is a certain anonymity that comes with living in a giant urban center, and Articulated Intersect helps grant presence to the individual user through a literal beacon of light. Their location is known to people from miles around through their interactions with the skyline. Lozano-Hemmer had hoped that Articulated Intersect would have been installed on the US-Mexico border so people in both countries could interact with the lights and create a unifying bond. Still, the fact that it was installed in Montreal made it no less impactful for the individual users. There is an overarching theme of surveillance in his work and practice. Utilizing sensor technology and video cameras to simulate the quote-unquote staged gesture of public life. Cameras in bank machines, schools, offices, government buildings, traffic lights, inside taxi cabs. There are sensors that anticipate our movements. There's tracking that anticipates our buying habits. And the type of input that we have with the system is essentially invisible. There are a bunch of invisible forces that create an identity we hardly even see. Articulated Intersect makes real our input into the public data pool. Our actions are directly observable and measurable and can be seen by strangers from miles away. This injects a sense of play into a rather serious and scrutinizing event. Humans are screened every day, unbeknownst to them, for a variety of reasons. And it's a way to re-empower the individual by having these interactions come with a sense of play. And some peers that Lozano-Hemmer had worked with and affiliated with helped him accomplish his goals. Will Bauer, for example, helped him develop The Trace, which is a series of sensors that coordinated audiovisual elements and sensor technology between two different locations, reinforcing his idea of telematic space and telepresence. Harper Reed helped him develop Friend Fracker, which allowed participants to enter their Facebook user information, and the program would automatically and indiscriminately delete 10 friends. Facebook shut down the program within days of its inception, but the point had been made. Online virtual communities continue to build themselves and destroy themselves without our awareness or full consent. Lozano-Hemmer's work engages users and helps them question established infrastructure. Communication technology will continue to shrink in size and expand in power. Lozano-Hemmer's work communicates a message of optimism and hope that humans will not lose sight of what it means to communicate with one another. Ultimately, we deserve the right to be in control of where and when we intersect.
Innovation and technology.
Hemmer's articulated intersects is as mesmerizing as it is fascinating. While its dramatic array of lights easily grabs one's attention, it's an equally impressive technological achievement. To appreciate Hemmer's installation, one would have to imagine him or herself as a participant, and perhaps the most obvious feature of the installation is the enormous beams of light pointed directly through the sky. These beams of light are produced by searchlights, those which we would typically see in movie premieres or prison security if you've ever been to prison. The use of electricity as a light source is more than a century old, and its method actually predates Thomas Edison's patented light bulb. Edison didn't invent the light bulb, but improved it by increasing its lifespan, and he did this by using a carbon-based filament. This was an important adjustment to the searchlight. Searchlights are composed of two key components, an arc light and a parabolic reflector. Arc lights were lamps with carbon-based electrodes which produce a tremendous amount of light, and parabolic reflectors would magnify and direct that light. In the early 1900s, searchlights had a very militaristic purpose, which was to identify enemy positions at night and search for wounded soldiers during the First and Second World War. However, the traditional use of the searchlight and its components quickly changed after World War II. The carbon arc was no longer used as a light source, and it was replaced by xenon arc lamps and LEDs, since they don't burn out as fast and are generally much safer. Searchlights also adopted much more commercial use and are now associated with parades or special events. Despite this, Hemmer uses searchlights to create an interactive, intimate experience, something which allows people to amplify their gestures on an urban scale instead of scanning the sky randomly. So once again, place yourself controlling a lever at one of these stations. You move the lever and one of the searchlights mimics the path you outlined. Automatically, two other searchlights shoot into the sky and trace a similar path intersecting your original beam of light. So how does this work? If one lever controls one searchlight, how do the other two searchlights know where to intersect? To do this, Hemmer uses an optical encoder, that is, an electromechanical device that converts the angular motion of a shaft, or in this case a lever, into digital information. Optical encoders were developed in 1951 as a way to improve upon its predecessor, the brush encoder, which was a similar device that relied less on digital computing. By using digital information in lights, optical encoders proved to be much more efficient. They didn't make as much noise, they were faster, and they were more precise. Optical encoders were purposed for their first satellites around 1960, and over time optical encoders have adopted to new sources of light. In both the history of the searchlight and the optical encoder, both technologies incorporated new light sources. Once again, we see the use of incandescent light bulbs, xenon flash tubes, and LEDs being incorporated in optical encoders. By now it's quite obvious that Hemmer has a fascination with lights. Pulse front, articulated intersects, pulse cornice, voice tunnel, and open air, and much more. All of these installations use either searchlights, optical encoders, or both. Imagine yourself one last time at the articulated intersects. You move the lever and in turn control 3 lights. In the distance you see someone else controlling a set of lights, so you decide to intersect with them. As soon as you do this, your lever and your light stop moving, and for a brief moment, your light begins to pulse, and the lever begins to vibrate. This is the result of haptic feedback, or haptics. It's the use of touch feedback in a user interface to provide information to a user. Haptics has been in use since the 20th century in all sorts of technologies and is still used today. Probably the most relatable use of haptic technology is when your phone vibrates when you receive a text or when you die in a video game. Haptics has been given a huge role in the 21st century with the rise of computing. It's seen in mobile devices, gaming consoles, the creation of exoskeletons to enhance the senses, virtual reality, and so much more. So why does Hemmer use haptics in articulated intersects? Well, this installation was actually meant to be placed along the US-Mexican border. Being a Mexican-born artist, he wanted to do this because he felt the division between the two, and this installation would actually be an effort to unite the US and Mexico. By placing this installation across borders, citizens from both countries would be able to interact with each other, while also dispelling the fear of Mexicans being tracked and hunted by using searchlights as an artistic medium.
Aesthetics.
In this section, I will discuss the aesthetics of Rafael Lozano-Hemmer's designs, pertaining more specifically to his artwork, Articulated Intersect. Now, as was mentioned earlier in this video, Articulated Intersect simply is the use of 18 searchlights to control patterns and vertices in the sky. These searchlights are controlled on the ground by passerby. I will begin by touching on aesthetic concepts involved in light and continue into a short history of light art and relational art, and from there touch on several interesting topics that came up during research. There are many elements that contribute to good design in lighting: brightness, color, direction, technology, beam spread, illumination angle, beam edge softness, location, depth of shadows, and more. But we can actually reduce these to four main points: intensity, color, distribution, and movement. Intensity is the brightness of a space that show a little bit about activity levels and overall experience. Brightness can also draw our interest and focus our attention, as in theater use where spotlights are shown on areas of interest to the audience. Color includes considerations about the warmth and coolness of the light. Distribution refers to the way light is used to fill a space. Is there more light in one area over another? Movement is probably the least obvious element of light. Sometimes it's obvious, like in theater's follow spots. Other times it's less obvious, such as a slow shift of colors, brightness, or distribution of the light. What do we think light is, though? To the average person, light is, well, light. It is what we need to see. It is what we get when we flip a switch. We don't think about it unless it's especially bad or beautiful. Light is an essential substance of the universe. It is ubiquitous, ephemeral, and mysterious. As such, it is a powerful tool to evoke sensations, tell stories, and convey emotions, well, essentially create art. While Rafael Lozano-Hemmer deals in many different areas and genres, Articulated Intersect is primarily involved in the genre of light art, as well as relational art, or as he calls it, relational architecture, which I will get into in a moment. The first mention of the term light art was used in 1930 by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy on his creation of kinetic light artwork called Light Space Modulator. While the term began in 1930, there is still evidence of art which uses light as far back as 30,000 BC. The Chauvet Cave paintings presents a series of horses in such a way that they seem to be moving. In regular light, they just look like a static image, but in the flickering light of a flame, they almost look like they're moving, which is most certainly what the painter was going for, especially considering that they didn't have fluorescent lights and were probably using torches. We find more interest in the effects of light in art in pieces such as Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, where he broke ground with his skill to create the illusion of three-dimensional forms with contrast between light and dark. This effect is called the chiaroscuro. It wasn't until around the 1920s that artists made works that moved, or that were the sources of light. Now, art no longer stood still in space and time. Artists were involved in the electric light, liberated art from its dependency on external light sources, and made it the source of its own illumination. Ingmar Bergman's movie Winterlight contrasts light and darkness to address the tone of the movie. Olafur Eliasson's artwork Beauty showed similar techniques of finding the balance between light and dark, producing an ethereal piece that moves and flows almost like a supernatural entity. Some other famous artists working in light art today are James Turrell, Robert Irwin, Bill Culbert, Angela Bullock, and Gunda Forster. At this point, I want to interject a short summary of the relational aesthetics and the core ideas that form the base of Lozano-Hemmer's work. In the late 1990s, Nicholas Bourriard writes a collection of essays entitled Relational Aesthetics. The purpose of these writings were to explore the art that focused on creating moments of unscripted social interaction. They work to create opportunities for generating relationships between people in a way that is open-ended and not prepared, which, according to artists practicing relational art, produces unique and beautiful relationships. This also contrasts the top-down form of communication, where information is fed to participants, whereas relational art produces open communication. This is a crucial point for one of the topics I will bring up shortly. Some of the artists involved in this kind of art are Rirkrit Tira-Venezia and Karsten Holler. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer uses this idea in his own work in what he calls relational architecture. All of his relational architecture projects, in some way, have participants reacting or acting towards the architecture of the space in which the artwork is situated. His work balances often massive spaces with small individual and personal actions. This creates the opposite effect of the looming, phantasmatic, or cultish extravaganzas whose effects were created to overwhelm the senses, to evoke false unity. Instead, relational architecture is a reminder that our public and social spaces are never neutral and attempts to be a method to encourage communication versus distribution. Now keep this in mind while I take a short detour into a little bit about searchlights. Around the world in every culture, fear of darkness is one of the most three common fears. Light battles darkness, it's an ever-present metaphor. Now spotlights are the iconic method of light distribution to see through the darkness to reveal hidden things. The first 60-inch searchlight was made by General Electric in 1893. The high-intensity arc searchlight was developed in 1918 by the American inventor Elmer A. Sperry, and it became the standard equipment of the main military forces of the world, and also was widely used commercially. Early searchlights were used to illuminate some large iconic structures like the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty. The searchlights we use were manufactured in the early 1940s by the General Electric and Sperry Gyroscope Company for the U.S. military as anti-aircraft searchlight units. Searchlights were increasingly useful during wars and were used as far back as the Anglo-Boer War to defend towns under attack. During World War I and World War II, searchlights were used for the illumination of enemy planes, detection of enemy troops, etc. After the war, the searchlights were used for victory parades, and ever since then, they have been associated with celebrations and special events. Searchlights were used by Hollywood movie studios to announce film premieres and grand openings in a glamorous and festive manner. This brings me to a very interesting contrast between Lozano-Hemmer's work and that of Albert Speer, the chief architect for the Third Reich. Speer was an architect who was, by his own admission, intoxicated by what he heard and saw at the Nazi rallies. He rose in the ranks of the Nazi Party, and after impressing Goebbels, he was introduced to Hitler, who liked Speer's ideas about how architecture could be subtle and obvious at the same time. For Hitler, size equaled power. Hitler had Speer design the Nuremberg parade ground where he held his rallies. For this, Speer developed the Cathedral of Light, which consisted of 130 high-powered searchlights surrounding the square. At night, they gave the impression that the people were standing in a giant Greek temple with massive marble pillars. Albert Speer's designs then became icons of Nazi megalomania. Treating his own designs as those in urban contexts and the aesthetics involved, Lozano-Hemmer doesn't focus on the understanding of the space, rather on the emotional involvement of the user within it. That's to say that, for example, Articulated Intersect, which was placed in Montreal for a light festival, wasn't so much about it being in a square in Montreal. It was really all about the emotions that were created by people using and interacting with the artwork. He gets people to actively participate using links and audiovisual content to pull meaning into the experience. Lozano-Hemmer divides most of his work between what he calls subsculpture and relational architecture. Articulated Intersect, of course, falls into the category of relational architecture. He focuses on putting traditional concepts of space into perspective, as well as ideas of body and architecture, and the demonumentalizing of urban spaces. This last one is important to note because it contrasts with Albert Speer's work, The Cathedral of Light. Whereas Speer's searchlights were effective at creating awe from magnitude and dramatic beauty, the goal was to create unity through an almost godlike reveal. It was devoid of any personal attachments or feelings. This links back to what we said earlier about the top-down communication, really top-down distribution. In general, Lozano-Hemmer's work is an attempt to overcome the dualism between public and private space in favor of a shared territory, in which the installation offers the user a personal vision of a site. So, in contrast, Lozano-Hemmer is all about those personal connections between people and people and architecture, as well as a solid base for people to communicate and share ideas. All of his works operate in a mix between the seduction of participation and the violence of predatorial control systems. In this case, the violence comes in the form of the iconography of searchlights and the stereotypes they bring, of violence, interrogation, military, and border patrol. When Rafael Lozano-Hemmer deals with light, he doesn't deal with it in the way that James Turrell and many other light artists do, which is to characterize light as light of spirituality or light of enlightenment. The light Lozano-Hemmer uses is the light of violence, and that's exactly the stereotype and the image that he wants to bring, which is why he uses searchlights. For the artist, the most important part of this piece actually is the connections. When two lights connect, you actually feel it in the lever. The levers freeze and resistance is applied like what one feels in a game controller. It's a moment of intimacy, he says, and almost like a handshake in the air.
Hello, my name is Jaden, and today I will be presenting the related works of Articulated Intersect by Rafael Lozano-Hemmer. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer has many works involving relational architecture. Today we're talking about light and bringing people together through art. This is pretty much what Rafael Lozano-Hemmer did in every one of his pieces revolving relational architecture. Alright, we're going to start off with a piece called Solar Equation. This piece consists of a simulation of the sun that is 100 million times smaller than the real thing. By downloading an app, participants can change animations of the sun using their fingers. They can also change the colors that pop up. There's a lot of complicated stuff that's going on in here, but pretty much the animation is being calculated using equations that simulate the flares and other events that happen on the sun. This piece is also very similar to Oliver Ellison's The Weather Project, as they both are relational architecture pieces that involve the sun. Alright, we're now going to get into the ultralight beams. Shout out to Kanye. The first related work requires us to go all the way back to 1999. In 1999, Rafael Lozano-Hemmer created Vectorial Elevation. The title Vectorial Elevation is an allusion to conceptual artist Sol LeWitt's Art of Instructions. It was also inspired by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's paintings by telephone, which was done in 1922. Vectorial Elevation is an art project that Rafael Lozano-Hemmer created in order to celebrate the coming of the year 2000. This project consisted of a website that anyone on the internet could access. On the website, the goal was to create a customizable design using giant searchlight beams. The idea of using light beams to communicate was done again by Rafael Lozano-Hemmer in November of 2003, when he took it to the next level by not only having computers, but also including cell phones. This piece was called a modal suspension. Messages would bounce from light to light visually and could be caught using a cell phone. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer's work was always a reflection of the technology that was emerging at the time. In 2007, Rafael Lozano-Hemmer brought himself to Toronto's harborfront in order to create his newest piece of relational architecture, Pulsefront. Pulsefront takes his primary idea of relational architecture and adds another layer of human interaction. Using sensors, anyone that would pass by one of the setups and touch it would immediately have their heartbeat translated into light. At times where no one would be around, the piece would play the last 10 recorded sequences. This culminated in one of the most notable human characteristics, the heartbeat, being shown on a grand urban setting. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer would then do similar projects relating to heartbeats with his Pulse Corniche project, which was pretty much the same thing, and the Pulse Park project, which also depicted heartbeats. However, in this case, the beams of light were displayed flat in Madison Square Park instead of in air.
This building, so now the entire park is reacting to your heart. That's you. That's you.
We now come to 2008 with Voz Alta. This work was created for the 40th anniversary of a student massacre that happened in Mexico City. Voz Alta, according to Google Translate, means loud voice. In this work, participants speak into a megaphone, and the louder they talk, the brighter the light gets.
Hoy esta pieza está recogiendo esa suposición, que podemos hablar aquí, que podemos ser escuchados, no desde una posición de poder, sino desde una posición en la tierra, en el suelo. Por un lado tenemos a un Estado y una parte de la población que, debido a la criminalidad, imaginan que pudiera eliminarse toda forma de conflicto y violencia, que pudiéramos crear un sistema de seguridad totalmente cerrado, en donde no podría en ningún momento tener que negociarse con el hecho de que la injusticia se convierte en violencia.
A similar project was done in 2012 called Open Air. This project had a similar premise but moved on from Mexico City all the way to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In this project, a mobile app was used to send voice messages as well as a personalized website.
I've done remote applications for a very long time. Like I've done a lot of telepresence pieces where you're activating stuff at a distance. But the problem with Vectorial is that there's a sense of distance, which I wasn't really liking. The smartphone is beautiful because you've already got everything that you need. You're already familiar with the device itself. So, and you can be in the parkway participating. So there is a relationship that is much more strict or direct than with previous telepresence projects.
When asked why he used the various technologies he did for Open Air, Lozano-Hemmer said, "There are three main technologies, all with military background: searchlight, internet, and GPS." Open Air also had a library of messages recorded by various famous Philadelphians that would be played at random times. These people included M. Night Shyamalan, Tina Fey, Questlove, Santigold, Maurice Sendak, and Patti LaBelle. Lozano-Hemmer said this on why he decided to bring this to the USA. "The exhibition is very important for me because, especially in the United States, there are certain stereotypes with Hispanics. The reality is there are many stereotypes about who we are and how we are. It has a very romantic view of Frida Kahlo and Picasso, but we are more. Finally, we have Voice Tunnel." Voice Tunnel was a piece done in the Big Apple, New York City. The process starts with someone speaking into a microphone, and the sound recording is then converted into a light beam, where bright means loud and dark means soft. The tunnel used is the Park Avenue tunnel and can be accessed from both sides. Once a new recording is made, the previous one is pushed one position down, and once all 75 positions have been used up, the light and sound is gone forever.
Most of these installations in public space, what I really want is for people to just kind of encounter the projects, not to go there as if it's like some kind of show. Because if you're going to see a show, you kind of have a certain expectation of just being a passive spectator and getting the show served to you. Whereas in my projects, you are the show. It is your participation that actually makes the project happen.
When speaking on what he hoped to get out of his works, Lozano-Hemmer said, "Hopefully through the media and through word of mouth, people will find out those lights are controlled by participation."
Kaylin, I love you more than anything, and no matter what, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?
Participation and unity is what Lozano-Hemmer has always focused on in all of his pieces, and that connection appears even in his works today. It is that common idea and theme that is a centerpiece of relational architecture. And the fact that it shows up in so many of Lozano-Hemmer's related works really shows that Lozano-Hemmer's main goal is to bring people together.
When was the last time you had chicken tasting so good made you want to smack somebody?